Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm sorry this next chunk of the video series took so long. Just it turned out that as I was writing I had more and more to say, and then I'd read something where someone was saying what I wanted to say more powerfully and more eloquently, which always kind of sucks, but it was good to engage with. But let's get a move on. In previous videos we examined some ideas around firearms and violence, and established that violence has shown a marked decrease, particularly in the developed world, over the period for which we have records, that firearms are not a measurable causal factor in violence levels, that the relationship between the media's desire to sell eyeball time and our own well-documented tendency to focus on the dramatic makes these truths appear as if they're the other way around, and that a focus on gun policy and gun control distracts us from other potentially useful policy interventions that would increase quality of life for many, many people. In this video, I'm going to try a slightly different set of arguments. Going back to what I said in the first video, the plan I gave you initially was to discuss appropriate responses to the effects of firearms on violence. Of course, that was a bit of a trick, since in coming to my positions and researching and writing these, I worked out pretty quickly that the effect was tiny, if there was any effect at all. So now that you know that, this video will have a slightly modified form. We'll be running a little thought experiment, and that experiment will follow the line of thinking starting with, what if we're wrong? What if there really is some way that firearms correlate with violent crime rates in a way that the statistics are not revealing? Now, I hope no one misunderstands or quotes me out of context. I do not believe this to be the case. I believe that the best available evidence is that this is not the case. But I believe that following this thought experiment can be instructive. So if there were such an effect, if the evidence were misleading us in some way or another, what would an appropriate response be? Now, I'm going to keep this within the realms of possibility. If the presence of a single gun caused homes for miles around to be sucked into another dimension, well, our response would be pretty clear. But more seriously, what if there were some measurable upward effect that relatively prevalent firearms had on violence levels? So yes, it would have to be quite small, but stranger things have happened. To give a précis of the arguments, the strict gun control position starts with, it's already the case, something must be done urgently, and here is something. And the person with the position, starting with relative freedom to own guns, responds with, no it isn't, and your proposed policy interventions would be counterproductive and harmful. And then the shouting starts. The issue, as so often happens, is that of the referent. Both of these sentences contain the word it, with very different understandings of what the it is that they're talking about. Typically, when we unpack those ideas, it seems that people in favour of harsh gun control use it to mean gun deaths specifically, while people in favour of more liberal gun ownership policies use it to mean violent deaths or violent crime more generally. I find the former an odd position. It presupposes that gun crime or gun deaths are a meaningful and separable category of events in a way that deaths by other means are not. People typically don't talk about screwdriver crime, or the UK's Daily Mail aside, knife crime, or even in the wake of the Rwandan genocide, no one spoke about agricultural tool crime. I'm going to make an analogy here that I know gun control proponents hate, but I think it's instructive in this instance, so just play along for a moment. Motor cars. I'm not going to make the usual analogy with deaths in vehicle collisions, but rather with their use as an element in other crimes, let's say robberies. If a lot of robbers used, for example, Mercedes-Benzes to engage in cash-in-transit heists, and this was a trend in South Africa for a while, or hell, if they were showing up a lot in speed traps, and one reduced the number of Mercs in circulation, that would probably reduce the number of Merc offences. In the same way, if harsh gun regulation were to reduce the number of firearms in criminal hands, and it's not clear how strong that effect would be in South Africa, then yes, the number of gun crimes would decrease. But that's a kind of banal truism that says nothing about the importance of the murkness to instances of robbery or of speeding, or of gunness to other crimes. This is kind of what Dan Dennett calls a deepism, something that is true but trivial in one sense, and dramatic but vague or false in another. The assumption must be that firearms are qualitatively or quantitatively causal, in ways that other items that can be used in crime or can be dangerous are not. Again, the evidence is that this isn't the case, but let's stick with the thought experiment and keep pretending that it could be. The second half of the response is that further restrictions on firearm ownership will or won't reduce the it. And here's where things get slippery. I hope I can keep it straight. The prediction from Mr. Harsh Gun Control is that the introduction of a new set of stricter controls will decrease gun deaths, and that overall deaths will drop as a result. The prediction from Ms. Relatively Free Gun Regulation is that people intent upon crime will choose another method, or obtain guns illegally to do so, and that the proposed regulation would not have the intended effect. Now, when we plot violent crime against per capita gun ownership for various countries, there isn't the trend line you would expect if Mr. Harsh were correct. And the evidence from South Africa certainly suggests that expectation to be mistaken. The current firearms control regime, the Firearm Controls Act of 2000, was passed, in 2000, and this is touted by some people as being the reason for the decline in violent crime in the early 2000s. But the major provisions of the Act were only brought into force in 2004, in the middle towards the end period of that decline, which started around 99 and was tapering off by 2005. It certainly doesn't drop any faster. The Australian example shows something very similar. After a terrible spree killing in 1996, an extremely stringent set of restrictions were put into place, and then made even harsher after another murder in 2002. The head of the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics noted in 2005 that, I quote, "The fact is that the introduction of those laws did not result in any acceleration of the downward trend in gun homicide. So like South Africa, violent crime was decreasing anyway, and the new tightening of gun restrictions did nothing to enhance that trend." At this point we should all applaud Mr. Weatherburn, who I just quoted. He's on record about these results being contrary to his assumptions and his point of view, and frankly making him miserable, but his commitment to his duties and his research took precedence. So again, we get back to the idea that even if there were some minor effect that guns were raising violence levels in some way, it's pretty clear that new regulations are unlikely to be effective. But again, let's play along with the game and pretend that this isn't the case. What if harsher restrictions in South Africa or Australia had worked? What if they'd had some slight but measurable effect, and the numbers suggested that this could work again? Either a second round of constriction in South Africa, or another tightening in the US or somewhere else. And here I'm going to use the example of alcohol prohibition in the United States, a dismal social experiment of which they are still suffering the hangover in the form of that terrible, destructive war on drugs. Now, lots of people talk about how prohibition was a failure. It gave power and money to organized crime, it encouraged police and political corruption, it pushed the state into people's private affairs where it had no business going, etc., etc. And all of that's true. But for the purposes of this experiment, let's focus on something else. Prohibition, drumroll please, was a success. Considered extremely narrowly, of course. The organization that pushed for it to be instituted, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, still exists. They had a bit of a rant, I remember, when beers were drunk at an informal meeting hosted by Barack Obama. And some members still campaign for prohibition to be reinstated. They point to data that, during Prohibition, alcohol consumption went down. Naturally enough, it was harder to get, and therefore more expensive than before. People were still drinking it, but not in the same quantities, and mostly it was wealthier people. Further, hospitalizations due to alcohol-related health problems decreased as well. Hooray! And yet we still, those of us on the left anyway, agree that prohibition was a pretty bad thing. Why? Well, why? Because those effects aren't really worth talking about when divorced from context. And in context, the picture's a lot less rosy. Entrenchment of organized crime into the political infrastructure, policies that have led to the imprisonment of millions of poor Americans, and entrenchment of the idea that moral panics can, or should, drive policy. Of course, when I talk about the problem of mass imprisonment in the US, it's not directly the specific policies of the 1920s that did that, but rather the ideas that were formed about what the appropriate role and actions of the state can be. So if you define success as dropping the per capita alcohol consumption, you get one result. But if you define it more broadly as having a beneficial effect on people's lives, on society in general, you get another. By the same token, if you were to define successful gun control nakedly as reducing the number of firearms in private hands, then yeah, sure, any number of regulatory regimes could be successful to some extent, but is that a kind of success worth having? Is it really success considered more holistically? Now, hopefully those who are paying attention have worked out where I'm going with this. Even if we were wrong, if the evidence, which in reality points away from firearms being causative in violence levels, and away from harsh firearm regulations being helpful in reducing violence levels, if that evidence were misleading us, I think that there would still be very good reasons why, as progressive liberals, we should be extremely suspicious of jumping on that particular bandwagon, why we should worry about the broader social effects of such policies. My argument will cover three main areas. These are the role and powers of the police, the role of powers of the state vis-à-vis the citizenry, and the history of arms control and rights. I think that each of these, considered individually, points towards my conclusions, and taken as a whole, they point extremely strongly towards the idea that being in favor of strict gun controls is not really consistent with progressive politics in general, and that being in favor of relative liberty to be armed is entirely consistent with it. Of course, in practice, each of those areas merges into the others, but I'll do my best to keep it structured. So, with that overly lengthy introduction out of the way, onto the meat of this video. Part the first, the police. The argument is relatively frequently made by proponents of strict gun control that arms are only suitable for police and military use, that their duties and training are such that they are the only ones with the need for firearms and the capacity to use them safely, and that civilians have neither that need nor that capability. I hope you noticed the scare quotes I put around the word civilians. See, did it again. They're important. This is one of the arguments that makes my head explode, and, the evidence aside, is one of the things that drove me most strongly out of the extremely harsh gun control camp where I sort of started out. I think it has dangerously reactionary implications that strike at the very heart of a free and progressive society. It also profoundly misunderstands what the police are, what they're for, and what they're not for. And that misunderstanding has the potential to deeply damage society to an extent that private firearms ownership couldn't in 1,000 years. First, that word, civilian. When someone says, cops need guns but civilians don't, there are two arguments going on. One about need, and the other about what makes a cop, and it's the second one that we'll deal with first. The idea that the police are not civilians is a deeply pernicious, dangerous one, and is demonstrably false. This will be the first of several history lessons, I'm afraid, but like most things, the truth is a set of not too exciting little details, not a cute soundbite. What makes someone a civilian or not a civilian? This distinction speaks to the idea, and it's a very old idea, that there are different types of law that apply differently to different people. The idea that different rules apply to serving soldiers goes back as far, just for one example, as ancient Rome, and while it seems so intuitive and natural to us, we must remember just how important and fundamental the distinction is. And the same idea is found in medieval legal principles, with the distinction between civil and ecclesiastical law. In other words, the idea that different laws applied to priests and that regular courts did not have jurisdiction over them. While the idea that priests should have different laws and courts has fallen by the wayside, thankfully enough, the distinction between military and civilian law is well entrenched. Serving soldiers are subject to military laws and are tried in courts martial with very different requirements from non-soldiers, who are tried in civilian courts. We tend not to call them civilian courts because we see them as the norm, but that doesn't make it any less the case. Now, police are, of course, subject to civilian laws, tried in civilian courts, and as liberals, we should be extremely happy about this. Leaving aside the occasional failures of those courts to correctly oversee the police, it's still a very good and important principle. Part of the confusion might come from the distinction that we do make between civil and criminal law, with the idea that civil means private or not government-related. But that's civil used in a very different sense from how it's used in the word civilian. Now, some might say I'm nitpicking, that the specific terms aren't that important and we all know what they mean, and that if we rephrase it to say cops aren't regular private citizens but have special responsibilities, it becomes fine. And I'm sympathetic to that line of thinking in general. Sometimes reasonable arguments are derailed by people being overly precious about terminology. And it's always better to rephrase your opponent's argument in the strongest way before engaging with it, rather than moaning about trivialities. But sometimes it really does matter, and this is one of those times, even when reframed and rephrased. The idea that cops are actively and definitively civilians has a long and proud history, certainly in the police services of the Anglophone world, with which I'm most familiar. And this tradition is something that's under tremendous threat. It has been for some time, and those threats are something that liberals like me should be far more worried about than any realistic harm that firearms might cause, even if we were wrong, the evidence was wrong, we didn't understand what was going on. Modern policing in the UK dates more or less from 1800, when the Glasgow Police was established. This was cemented with the establishment of the Metropolitan Police in the 1820s under the guidance of Robert Peel. Now, this was a fairly major step and faced pretty stiff resistance. Previously, law enforcement had involved parish constables as people who recorded evidence, presented it to a justice of the peace, who also had bailiff duties and the responsibility of raising the community to deal with major disturbances. And that's one of the major points I'm trying to make. In the countries whose police services descend from that idea, so that's South Africa, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, any number of other places, things that, like powers of arrest, things that we often think of as police powers, are nothing of the sort. Those fundamentals of public and community safety are vested in the citizenry in general, and not in some kind of authority figure. And this remains in those countries in fundamentals like the so-called citizen's arrest. In reality, there's nothing special about such arrest. It's the police arrest that's an outgrowth of a general citizen's right and responsibility, with additional duties of charging, gathering evidence, and seeing to the safe custody and civil rights of the accused. The uniformed professional police that people in the UK knew about at that time were the French gendarmerie, who were an outgrowth of the military, subject to different laws from civilians, and at the time had an extremely poor reputation for example, spying on political dissidents and using agents provocateurs to drive arrests. Being reluctant to such a force being placed in a position of authority over you is completely natural, and the new laws establishing the UK police services responded admirably to those concerns. Central to this was the notion of policing by consent, which is the idea that the police are not placed over the populace, but are members of the community, carrying out responsibilities on behalf of the general population. This is well expressed in Peel's maxim, the police are the public, and the public are the police. The 9 Peelian principles were taught to every new constable, and frankly I wish more modern police services used them still. These principles emphasized the police role as explicitly and actively not a military one, that it required community engagement and respect, that habitual use and active use of force diminishes that engagement and respect and should be used as seldom and as mildly as possible. That they are, and I quote here, only members of the public who are paid to give full-time attention to duties which are incumbent on every citizen in the interests of community welfare and existence. And then that they have no punitive role, that their efficiency should be measured on low crime rates and not on high arrest rates. None of these are militaristic functions at all. They involve responding to community concerns, making sure that no one's rights are abused, and it is those professional responsibilities that are what make the police different from regular private citizens, not their use of force. In fact, in this policing tradition, the police have no more authority to use force than anything else. Well, certainly not the level of force provided by a firearm or even a baton. Their right to self-defense is exactly the same as yours or mine. The only difference they are issued weapons and mandated to carry them is because their responsibilities are considered sufficiently likely to put them in a place where self-defense is necessary, and that warrant the expense of equipping them. Not because they have special rights to use that force. It's just that armed police, yes, even in the UK, your cops are armed. That's what those batons are, potentially lethal weapons. Armed police are so ubiquitous that we've forgotten these truths. We've come to believe that those weapons are part of their policeness that marks them out as separate. Of course, what I'm saying flies in the face of the specific duties of Police Special Operations Unit, who are more likely to be seen executing high-risk operations than other constables, and that are often armed close to a military level. But we must remember, and so must they for that matter, that the duty to be performed is one of an arrest, a search, a rescue, whatever, and that those arms are there to defend themselves in case they are attacked, not to attack anyone. It's just deemed that, again, such an attack on them is sufficiently likely to warrant taking such precautions for self-defense and the defense of others. Our negligence of these principles represents a betrayal of the very principles of a free society, principles that are central to my liberal politics. The late 20th and early 21st century has seen a marked increase in the militarization of police services in a lot of the world. Initiation of force, sometimes lethal force, by constables across the world, the use of military equipment and tactics as a first resort, not as a last option. And there are two books to which I'll link in the description that lay out this process and the problems that it brings far better and at far greater length than I can. These are Maurice Punch's Zero Tolerance Policing and Radley Balco's Rise of the Warrior Cop, the Militarization of America's Police Forces. Then follow that up with an article in The Guardian by Robert Reiner called Citizen versus the Police, the Orwellian Struggle. While his article is more about surveillance and oversight of the police rather than use of force, they all describe the move of police forces away from the policing by consent, citizens in uniform ideal towards the police as a security service or a militarized force, with a state of siege between the forces of the state and the citizenry, particularly the poor and the powerless, driven by the excesses of overreach of the war on drugs and the war on terror, by which I of course mean the war on the poor and the war on brown people. And the increasing strength of this awful narrative of cops as warriors, or use of arms professionals, first and foremost. Now, of course, and I want to emphasize this, cops' lives and jobs can be dangerous, and I want them to be able to defend themselves vigorously and successfully when that need arises. But when we define them by that armed conflict role, when that becomes their most salient characteristic, well, no good comes of it. I've heard a number of complaints from US soldiers in Iraq that as their role became more one of law enforcement, they became increasingly uneasy with it. To turn to literature, this sentiment was powerfully expressed by the great Bill Adama. I quote, "There is a reason you separate the military and the police. One fights the enemies of the state, the other serves and protects the people. When the military becomes both, then the enemy of the state tends to become the people." That's a scary statement, and I'd argue that the reverse is true as well. When the police becomes both, they become a force of occupation. Now, I know that sounds terribly dramatic, melodramatic even, and it may offend many of the serving constables who are doing their best to serve their communities with great professionalism. But their individual virtue doesn't change the fact that these narratives of weapons defining police and their functions, rather than just being part of their need as citizens who are required to be in unpleasant places more often than should be asked of anyone, that these narratives are driving behaviours and processes that are deeply destructive to the fabric of a free liberal society. And that talking about firearms as being something for the police contributes to those narratives far more than I'm willing to do so. Yeah, far more than I'm willing to do. So yes, where are we? We've dealt with the civilian versus police versus military distinction and started on the need issue. At this point, though, I think we've been going on for quite long enough. Must be almost, half an hour now. So let's take a break, and I'll continue in another video, hopefully sooner rather than later. Cheers.